Epic Pandemic by SMG Ready. My name is Mike Gerard, and if something happens to me, then this is my story. In 2018, the UK voted to leave the EU. So, Brexit was the beginning and the end of the United Kingdom. I remember thinking, this is something that will change not just mine, but also many other people's lives as well. Another referendum in 2019, Scotland broke away from England and Wales, acquiring its independence, and rejoined the European Union. Northern Ireland joined the Republic to become the United Republic of Ireland, and remained in the EU also. Now, why is this important to me? Well, my girlfriend's dad, Johnny, moved to Glasgow. He was Scottish by birth and wanted to stay in Europe for business. He had moved to London as a child and only used to go back when somebody died. It just made sense and saved a lot of money. Visiting was pretty straightforward. You just showed your driving license or passport and drove through. We tried to see him as often as we could, but we were very busy building our lives, and the London restaurant scene was full on busy. In 2021, things would change in a big way, and I mean not good for everyone. Some of the things you notice that start to make you think. People who were wearing face masks and gloves on the tube. It's subtle at first. Then you see supermarkets running out of stock, schools closing, forced isolation, and social distancing. This is when you have your thoughts and doubts about how serious things are going to get. People start to panic and think of stocking up in case of restrictions, and quarantine is the solution. It is good to be prepared, but within reason. I know for a fact my local corner shop will never close, not even in a World War III apocalypse. He's never closed, not even on Christmas Day. So, it all began like many of my days did. There was silence, and then there was music. Loud music. It was 7 a.m. and I had to get going soon as my deliveries were due. Rose was up cleaning and listening to Radio 1. I think it was Cold Beating Heart playing, so I was forced into waking up. I could feel the sun shining through the gap in the blinds, so I knew it was a nice sunny morning. I got up with my eyes half closed and moved to the TV room. I needed a cup of coffee. I sat down in front of the TV. This is how I like to start my day. While flicking through the TV channels, my eyes focused on the news about some virus that was spreading like forest fire in Italy. Morta-virus was similar to the normal cold and flu, but primarily affecting females. I got distracted when Rose switched off the TV, as she hated me watching telly so early. So we had our breakfast and left for work. Rose shouted, "Come on, Mike, I don't need to be late today." I met Rose a few years back after a friend had brought me to her dojo for a lesson. She was a black belt in karate and was the instructor that day. I didn't take up martial arts, but I did ask her out soon after, and was glad she didn't beat me up. Rose only had her dad, who was a retired doctor from the army. Now he had a wine import business that I knew very little about. He barely had time to visit us, so we would work around our commitments and go up there when we could. My restaurant in St. John's Wood was my life after Rose. I put my heart and soul into it and had a heavy mortgage that was not getting smaller anytime soon. Every night after Rose's karate class, she joined me for dinner at the restaurant. My best friend Freddie, who was an Uber driver, would collect her if I was too busy. The three of us were like family and used to hang around together. We would talk and laugh and had no idea that our little bubble in northwest London was about to burst in a major way. After I dropped Rose at her karate school, I hit the morning rush hour traffic, made my way to work. I pulled over next to my restaurant. As I was the owner and head chef, I had a large amount of work to do. Today was going to be a busy day. I had a lot of orders to take care of and a VIP party booked. Later that day, while I was doing my mise en place in the kitchen, I suddenly heard screaming and shouting, which came from the dining area. As I was trying to figure out what the hell was going on, I could hear someone smashing plates. I immediately asked my sous chef to go and check what was happening. He went and came back with a story. I was being told that outside, an Italian guy was being racially harassed by some other customers. I didn't know it yet, but this kind of thing would become a lot more common all over the country very soon. I had to go out there. I apologized to the man and told him I would deal with this situation right away. I walked up to the table by the window where the drunk racist was and asked him to leave. He was embarrassed, and he and his family left. I didn't get it right away, but then later I remembered the news in the morning. After finishing work and dinner, Rose and I headed back to our home. When we got a call from Rose's dad, he sounded pretty worried. Upon asking the reason, he spoke about the situation going on in Italy. He got informed by an old colleague from the Ministry of Defence about the danger we were all in. He told us about the Morta-virus, the one I saw on TV. He told us the simple virus was assumed to be some seasonal viral infection, was now getting out of control and had already killed thousands of people in Italy. The outbreak could not be contained. Most countries were about to go into lockdown. The French president was evacuated and all the states in France had been quarantined, but the outbreak could not be contained. This virus was unstoppable. It was an epic pandemic. It was confirmed to be in Italy, France, and was spreading fast across Europe. NATO, with most governments in the world, tried to block the media coverage and was giving misinformation as to not cause widespread panic. The Centre for Disease Control, the CDC, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, have been trying to work on a cure, some kind of vaccine, that was unsuccessful. Listening to all this, my heart felt so heavy. At that moment, I was very scared. It was like something from a movie. I thought this couldn't be real, but it was. As we hung up the phone, we continued along the road. I looked across the street, saw two guys on a moped shouting abuse at an old man from the Italian deli. They pushed him and drove off. I was going to help him, but Rose pulled me away and said we must go. We ran home and didn't look back. The next morning, there was no music. I just put on the news and it began. With the Morta-virus outbreak sweeping across the globe, we bring you live updates on the latest news developments and guidance on the global pandemic. The rapid spread of the virus has resulted in travel bans, major events cancellations, school closures, panic buying, and countries grinding to a halt as self-isolation, social distancing, and rationing gets enforced. 5 days later, the news became worse than before. A further 20,000 people have died after being diagnosed with Morta-virus in England. Health chief said, bringing the death toll in the UK to 500,000, with 80% of those deaths being female. NHS England said in a statement, the majority of patients were female aged between 24 and 74 years old. Some had underlying health conditions. While the majority of infected are female, this is still affecting males, just at a lower rate. Morta-virus, or Mortacanalypsis 21, as it's also known, is from a large family of viruses that cause illnesses similar to common cold at first, but can progress to nosebleeds, fevers, vomiting, or the most severe symptoms of paralysis or respiratory failure, and ultimately death. The strain that had recently emerged in Italy was a new strain that had not been previously identified in humans. Thought to originate in wolves, this was a zoonotic disease, meaning it gets transmitted from animals to people. Experts believe the virus is spreading in coughs and sneeze droplets. However, the virus can survive on surfaces for up to 12 hours. We advise people to socially distance and stay in your homes unless it's an emergency. We needed to get some shopping, food and household stuff, so I decided to go to Asda. There was a massive queue outside the supermarket, and no such thing as social distance. The 2-meter rule was non-existent. I was shocked to see people getting groceries like crazy. Trolleys full of water, paper towels, milk, pasta. Seeing the situation and how bad it was, I decided not to risk it. I got my car, drove to my restaurant and emptied my stock room and freezer. Well, at least this will keep us going, I thought. After getting home, I I was not feeling well. Rose asked me to change my clothes right away and take a shower. I was so confused. My mind got messed up about everything that was happening. Nevertheless, I washed and changed. Rose had dumped the clothes I was wearing before I came out of the shower. She was very stressed out, called her dad. Johnny asked her to monitor my body temperature strictly for the next few hours, see if there was any flu or cough-like symptoms. Till now, I had no idea what was going on. When Rose was done talking to her dad, I calmed her down by asking her to tell me why she was overreacting over such a small thing. Wondered why she pulled me away the other night, not letting me help the man out there. So many questions going on around my mind. After crying for several minutes, Rose was calm again, and we were able to talk. I was astonished to hear that the Morta-virus had spread across the globe to the Americas and the Far East, and found out to be super contagious. The new strain travelling from person to person, even through simple breathing and touching, the infected would make you sick. She got all this from her dad, who was currently working with the MOD and the Italian Secret Service to locate patient zero and help produce a vaccine. Now I was beginning to understand why the Italian man was getting abused the other day at the restaurant, and why I could hear random attacks outside. This was very serious. It was not going to be over anytime soon. It dawned on me this is why Rose was so scared. As directed by Rose's father, I didn't go out for the next few days, and Rose was constantly keeping a check on my body temperature. I was relaxed somewhat. I don't know how, but I was sure that nothing would happen to me, like I have a reason to be alive. 2 days later, thank God, I was doing perfectly fine and everything was normal. I was making coffee when I heard the phone. One of my friends told me my sous chef George was rushed to hospital last night because he had passed out and was having trouble breathing. I hung up and called his wife to see how he was doing and what exactly had happened to him. After what seemed like forever, his wife answered, and I was traumatized to hear that he was tested positive for the Morta-virus. She said he was put in complete isolation and no one was allowed in to see him. After the shock had set in, I told Rose about the situation. She burst into tears, scared and concerned about how things had changed so quickly. The same night, around midnight, we got a call from Rose's father. He told us there were multiple reports of viral infections across London and we should leave immediately. It was very alarming, the situation, and he also added that there was a Cobra meeting going on amongst government officials. They had suggested sealing off all the borders across the United Kingdom within the next few days. So far, Wales, Scotland and the whole of Ireland had remained virus-free. If we wanted a chance, we'd have to make a move and try and leave tonight. Soon there will be panic on the streets of London, and martial law will not stop people from harming each other in the carnage and the mass amounts of people trying to evacuate. London was a dangerous place now. By the sound of things, the government was ready to give up. As I expected, Rose was not ready to leave our home, but I made her talk to her dad and he was able to convince her. Within 48 hours, the news will break, so we have to go soon or risk being caught up in the chaos. Just then, I could hear a loud screaming coming from outside the communal hallway. I opened the door slowly and could see my neighbour, Miss Pinner, who was on the floor. She had been struck and was unconscious. Someone attacked her and stole her food shopping as she returned home. I ran towards her and I could see a young couple, maybe in their early 20s, running down the stairs. I picked up Miss Pinner and she woke up. Her head was a bit bruised and she was in pain, so I called Rose, who stayed with her. I gathered some food and some bits I had extra and gave them to her. She lived alone, so I guess it was tough, quite frightful to deal with this pandemic, and I thought it was right to help. I told Rose to ask her to come with us and we were leaving, but she refused. She wanted to stay at home, and I suppose believing things would get better soon. I, on the other hand, was not so naive. Outside I could hear police sirens and saw from the window a few ambulances with medical staff in protective hazmat suits surrounding the local tube station. Then someone announced the tube was closed for deep cleaning procedure. I thought this is one less way to get out of the city. I called Fred, told him what was going on. I said to him, grab some stuff and come to mine. Not long after he arrived in his Toyota Prius, Rose and I packed in what we could. We covered our face with masks and we brought a big bottle of hand sanitizer I took from our restaurant. I told Rose to keep the engine running while Fred and I got the last few bags. Fred grabbed my baseball bat for safety purposes. I took the last 2 bags of food. We looked all around. It was a bit dark down there. The lights in the car park were blinking. We ran to the car and started our escape out of the city. We had enough fuel to get to Scotland and 2 days to make it there. After that, the border would close and we would be trapped. It was night, so we planned to get as far out of London in the cover of the dark. We headed up the edge of the road and I told Fred to stop at the corner so we could get some more supplies. Most of the shops had already been looted and burnt out by the looks of things, but I thought we might be lucky. We locked the car. We went round the back alley. There was a food store and a camping shop next to it. We ran in, picked everything that we could get our hands on. I picked some food items and water. Fred was collecting things that we could use in emergency. He got some batteries, a torch and binoculars. Rose found a tent, sleeping bag and other things that would come in useful. We had enough staff, so it was time to go. We were rushing back to where we parked when we noticed there was a car behind us, some distance, that was watching us. The alley round the back was small, so there wasn't enough room for the people in the car to get closer. Not wasting a second, we all started to run as fast as we could, along with the supplies. All of a sudden, I heard gunshots. These people opened fire on us. We ran through the butcher shop and hid down low. I looked out the window for any danger and could see the car drive off. Luckily, they had not noticed our car on the corner. The coast was clear. We bolted to Fred's car, out of breath and very scared. We drove off fast in the opposite direction, with our eyes on the lookout for any danger. When we had travelled some distance, we looked on the map and decided to keep off the main roads as much as possible. Along the way, we saw a few people roaming the streets. It didn't feel very safe in the busy areas. The situation around was very depressing, and Rose was scared to death. After a few hours of driving, Fred was getting tired and hungry, so we pulled over. Fred was a huge fan of my cooking skills, but this time it was just simple bread and cheese. We all enjoyed the food, feeling a little relaxed, when I switched on the radio and went straight to the news channel. There was some new updates of the virus, explaining its intensity and how deadly it was. Still no mention of the border closing, and that was good for us. Thousands of people were dying all around the world and no cure for it as of yet. Huge number of deaths were being reported each day. Long story short, the situation was not good. I thought all night we had hardly seen anyone on the roads. As soon as people find out about the quarantine and the border closing, it will be crazy. We rested a few hours and tried to get some sleep. We heard a very loud noise that woke us up. As soon as we looked outside of the car, we saw a huge number of military vehicles heading towards London. Something odd I noticed was a strange insignia on the trucks, like a red triangle with an eye inside. I had a feeling I'd seen it before, but no idea what it was. We were not sure, but later we would find out that all the exit roads out of London were blocked. On the radio it said all flight operations were terminated in and out of the country, and it was the same in most other places. According to reports, the Morta-virus was rapidly spreading, and Africa, India and Australia had now been infected. Now it was on every continent, and only a dozen or so countries were virus-free. The government was still telling people to stay at home and remain calm. How could you be calm in a situation like this? Luckily, we still had contact with Johnny. We agreed to call him and keep him updated until we got to the border. As the light faded, we started to make our way back to the road. This was a road trip from hell, but also our fight for survival and a test of our will to live. We had been driving on small, quiet roads most of the time, but now we had to get onto the motorway. We pulled over to the side and walked up a bit of a hill to scope it out. Fred used the binoculars to look at the road ahead. The The first view we saw was truly devastating. How could this be England? People had abandoned their vehicles on the road, rubbish was all over the place, and the only noise we could hear was dogs barking. It looked just like we had entered an apocalypse, and as if it was the end of the world. You could see there was still enough room to drive past if we zigzagged, and we agreed to go on. Fred walked ahead, back down the hill. Rose hugged me, and we had a moment to talk. I promised her that everything would be fine soon, and I wouldn't let anything happen to her. Rose cried and was holding me very tight, as if she would never let me go. I almost forgot the terrible situation when out of nowhere I heard Fred shouting. And when I looked, what I saw was something I will never forget. A group of 5 people who looked like they were sleeping rough. 2 had knocked down Fred to his knees, holding him on the ground. The other 3 were raiding things from the car. We both ran towards him to intervene. It seemed like the 2 holding Fred were sick or maybe weak from hunger. I could see one of them had a knife to his neck. Fred moved back and I was able to push the knife away and get him free. Rose jumped in the air with a kick and the guy on the left went flying. She punched the guy on the right, he fell back. The other 3 stealers in the car stopped and ran, dropping our stuff on the road. I quickly picked up the bat that was hidden in the back seat. I was about to use it when Rose shouted, "Stop, let them go. They're just desperate." 2 people on the ground jumped up and ran. "Leave the knife," I said, and the attackers obeyed, leaving the weapon on the ground. Then I checked with Fred if he was okay. He was a bit shocked, but he was fine. We gathered up our belongings and packed them back into the car. It was time to move. We proceeded towards the motorway, zigzagging our way. As we looked at the derelict remains of our country outside the window, Rose started tuning the radio. It was the same emergency broadcast on every channel. Just then, she heard someone talking. It was like someone on a CB radio, saying to come to Stapleford Sanctuary and that it was safe. It said an address and it was about 2 hours drive away. When we looked, I wasn't sure, but Rose and Fred said we should go and check it out. Plus it was on the way north. Reluctantly, I agreed. Figured we would get there today, then tomorrow we could get to the border. It was about 6 hours from Stapleford, which was somewhere in Nottingham. Luckily Fred's car always had a UK road atlas, as Google Maps was not working. I had noticed there was no Wi-Fi signal, but the phones were still working for calls. I got comfortable and rested for a few hours. The further out of the city we travelled, the fewer abandoned vehicles we came across, so we could drive a bit quicker. I wondered about my sister and where she was. It had been 5 years since we spoke. She had children, I'd never met them, and she was divorced. That's all I knew about her. My family used to be close, but after my parents died, we had a big argument over our family's home. It was supposed to be left to my sister and me. That's what my dad wanted. As he passed first, it was up to my mum to decide. The problem I had was that Mum's will got changed shortly before her death. She was on a lot of medication, and I don't think she was in her right mind. I got informed by the solicitor after the funeral. The house was being sold, and my sister was the sole beneficiary. I never spoke to her again. Time moves on, and the world keeps spinning. It didn't seem so important now. Maybe I was getting wise in my age. She was often on my mind, and I wanted to see her again someday. I made myself promise, if I could, that I would find her if things ever returned to normal again. The drive was uneventful, and I had slept an hour or so. I was still tired and feeling hungry. We exited the motorway to stop a few miles from Stapleford to have some food, crisps and chocolate and some water. We used sanitizer on our hands, and we all put on masks just in case we came in close contact with anyone. The snack was good. I had the feeling we might need the energy to run away if things went south in this place. Soon after heading to the main town in Stapleford, we saw signs that said to keep heading west until you see the camp. We arrived at the checkpoint and we spoke to some guards who seemed friendly enough. They explained the local council had set up everything weeks before the Morta-virus outbreak. That seemed odd. I wanted to ask more, but they said we would have to do a medical checkup before we could enter. This was to keep the people inside safe, which was a reasonable request. We were asked to park and go to a waiting room, which was a prefab hut next to the checkpoint. There we waited as the doctors and medical staff began running tests. It was playing on my mind. Why were there so many medical personnel here? And how come the local council knew about an outbreak weeks before it got announced? Just then one of the doctors came out and was speaking to the security guard. Then he approached us and said we would have to leave. I didn't quite understand and asked why. He would not say. Then Fred asked to speak to him and he went to the office next to the waiting room. A few moments later, he returned and said that it's all okay now. I just didn't get it. What had just happened? What did Fred say to him? We were asked to drive to the main compound and past the security gates. They provided us with food, fresh new clothes, and said that we would be shown around and told where we would be staying. As we got in the car, I could see Rosa's face. She too had concerns. I asked Fred to explain. Wait until we get inside, then I will tell you everything, he said. After a few minutes drive, we parked up outside a hut that we'd being directed to. One of the sanctuary staff wardens showed us in and said we would head to the main meeting area tomorrow, the white building next to the river, at 9 a.m. for a briefing. The warden left us and I grabbed Fred. Now I want to know what the hell is going on here. He told us to sit down, and as the truth finally revealed, my heart sank into the pit of my stomach. He explained in 1994 he was studying business at University College London when his father was suddenly very ill. Fred's family owned the biggest import and export company in the UK. His family was very well off. I knew he had money and he didn't need to work. We had been friends for 5 years or so. We had met in the local gym in Kilburn. His father, before he died, told him that if he wanted to get his share of the family business, he had to join a Masonic fraternal organisation called Order of Eternal Sight, or OES for short. Now even Fred was studying business at the time. He was not set out for running his father's empire. His father had already decided his younger son Miles, who was Fred's half-brother, would be better suited to manage his legacy. Saying that, he still wanted Fred to inherit a large trust fund, so he would never want for anything. Fred continued, his father's conditions had to be met in full, and on his 30th birthday he got access to his trust. At first, Fred assumed the Order of Eternal Sight was just some old boys club, Freemasons with a lot of money. But after his induction, he soon realised their immense power and influence. Fred's family had been involved with them going back to his grandfather, who had founded the import business. They have made a lot of money during World War II, shipping weapons all over Europe. They had many people from all parts of government, even the Prime Minister. Fred soon realised their primary focus was to capitalise on chaos. They helped start wars, and then used various government departments to award contracts to rebuild bombed out cities. They would help fund policies and no doubt shape new regimes. New political party had formed in the UK. The power they once had in Whitehall had reduced. Certain powerful men who were once allies had moved away from the OES and had not kept their oaths to the order. Focusing on how to realign their brotherhood and regain control of the power they once had, the OES invested in a company called Acheron Industries, which was almost bankrupt after World War II. It was a small Austrian company that was now one of the world's biggest medical vaccine developers. They had designs on using this company to infect the human populations with new forms of viruses and would bring about the collapse of democratic governments across the globe, ushering the era of the New World and the Order of Eternal Sight. They had planned, manipulated to bring death and destruction to the world. In the ashes, they would rise to take control. For many centuries, they had done this kind of thing, and they would continue in the shadows. My mind was trying to take this all in. This was like the Illuminati or something from a film, the New World Order. I was lost and unable to speak for quite some time. I looked at Rose and I noticed her being in a similar state. She couldn't believe her ears and looked shocked. Seeing this, I suddenly thought that perhaps if it weren't for Fred, we would be stuck at home and facing a lockdown among the panic in London. For all I knew, in the city, we could have been killed for the food supplies we had stocked up already. Maybe it wasn't so bad, considering everything that happened to us while we tried to get somewhere safe. Or maybe it was my will to live and my promise to Rose. But now I was ready to face this pandemic, even if Fred belonged to the organisation that was responsible for it. We decided to speak again after a good night's rest, and Fred agreed that things like this take time to settle in people's minds. I spent the night without sleep, however. At first I tried, but after Rose fell asleep, I got up and walked to the window. I had a lot to think about. Global pandemic, death toll rising with each new day, panic among the people, lockdowns, checkpoints, martial laws, secret societies, and the new world order. This was all too much to handle. And Fred, he kept this secret so long, but could it affect our friendship? I didn't think so. After all, he wasn't amongst the high-ranking people who had set this all in motion. It was still very strange to think about something like this, a secret society that planned mass genocide just to get things going their own way. There were so many questions in my head, and even more will still come later when Fred and I sit down to discuss this entire situation, perhaps even without Rose. I didn't want to stress her out more. She had enough of that lately. As the day ended, I stood by the window. It suddenly dawned on me where I had seen the eye insignia on the trucks. It was Fred's tattoo. The first day I met him in the gym, it was on his upper right arm. I confronted him. He showed me and confirmed I was right. He said earlier at the checkpoint the test for him and I was negative, but Rose was inconclusive. That meant they were not sure, and that's why they wanted us to go. He spoke and showed his tattoo, and they agreed to try the test on Rose again tomorrow. A new world order will rise. Sounds ridiculous, right? For some, it will be better. For others, it will be a nightmare. But at least I have Rose beside me, and Fred, who got us this far, and he was still protecting us. Could I trust him? What other choice did I have? Fred went to his room. I looked at Rose and smiled. For her, I will do everything it takes to survive. I took her hands and we lay on the bed, holding each other, and finally fell asleep. I dreamt of my restaurant and our evening routine. Everything else that had happened recently, I had forgotten. I don't know how long I was sleeping, but I got woken from my amazing dream, roughly. Someone was shaking me, calling my name in a very quiet whisper. Mike, Mike. It took me a couple of moments to realize that I was awake. The pandemic was real, and that was Fred above me, trying to wake me up. Come on, wake up. We have to move. Now. Fred whispered in such a panic, as if our lives depended on how quickly we would get up and go. What the hell? Was all I could mumble. Understanding that I barely had a few hours of sleep, I looked at my watch. It was 2 a.m. Fred threw my clothes in my face, hurrying me up. Rose was awake, trying to pull the blanket up from her face and go back to sleep again. Fred looked so nervous that I realized that something was very wrong. Get up, both of you, Fred hissed. We need to leave now. Rose and I shook our heads and reluctantly got out of bed. He hurried us up and we got dressed. We got our things and left without asking what happened. As we got in the car, Fred kept looking around us. Maybe he thought that we would be followed or detained, I don't know. And I didn't want to ask just yet, because he seemed stressed out. We drove off, and Fred managed to get himself together to quickly explain his rude intervention to our sleep. The guard told me that the compound was going on quarantine. Someone brought in the Morta-virus, he said. We are supposed to leave today anyway, but if we leave later, we could be stuck here for God knows how long. So, we will be able to leave now? Rose asked him. still sleepy and disorientated. I made a deal. They should let us out. Now keep quiet. We came up to the checkpoint and one of the guards nodded to Fred, who gave him a brown envelope and let us through. Only when we got some distance between us and that place, Fred sighed with ease, and we stopped for a chat and quickly drink something. He told us staying there was dangerous, and quarantine meant we could be there for months. He knew how badly we wanted to reach Rose's father, so he decided to get us out of there any way possible. Plus, as Rose had not passed the test, and possibly she could be exterminated. What? It was safer to get out now and keep going. Once more, I was grateful to have such a friend. My doubts in him faded. I knew he was my best friend, and he had proved himself, regardless of his family connection to the OES. We set off again, and the road ahead seemed very dangerous. We didn't know what we'll meet on our journey. Fred, however, decided to keep away from big roads and motorways, staying on small ones that weren't as popular with drivers. Perhaps this decision kept us away from any trouble. Later on that day, as we drove through a small town close to the border, we stopped and we saw a public toilet. Some of us needed to go. From out of nowhere, we came upon a group of people who tried to attack us. One of them kept shouting, "Get the woman," referring to Rose. Fortunately, we managed to scare them off. Rose used her karate skills on some of them, kicking them, while Fred and I defended ourselves with the baseball bat and the knife we got from the first encounter. We jumped back in the car and drove off again. A few hours later, we reached Scotland. Rose was relieved. The closer we got to her father, the more relaxed she became. Yes, we still had a connection through mobile phones, even though they would cut off now and again. As we arrived at the border, we heard an announcement. They would close all entry to the UK in the next 40 minutes. We were lucky to have made it in time. We did a quick swab test and they let us pass the border. As happy as Rose was, she was also afraid that Scotland might be as dangerous, just like the UK. However, when we stopped in front of Johnny's home in Glasgow, Rose noticed that there were people in the streets going about their business. Yes, they still wore face masks and gloves for protection from the virus, but it looked like Scotland wasn't as affected by the Morta-virus as the rest of the world. She couldn't contain her happiness when her father ran out to greet us, and they hugged. I stood there looking at them, wondering if we were safe, but Johnny seemed very glad that we arrived. And once we were inside and fed, he told us the great news. We couldn't believe it. The world was slowly returning to its normal state. The virus was finally beaten, and vaccines were now being distributed all around the world. The World Health Organization had mysteriously found a vaccine developed by a scientist in Austria and was in the process of mass production. The governments of the world were queuing up to do business with Acheron Industries, and it looked like the OES had been successful in their dreadful plan. Millions of deaths, yes, the whole human race suffered greatly from this terrible pandemic. There were things I wish I didn't know and how I wanted to forget. But that was easier said than done. I looked at Johnny, then at Rose, and, finally, Fred. "Looks like you'll be reopening that restaurant of yours." Fred smiled at me. "Yes, my restaurant. I wondered if it was anything left inside. It was probably looted or burnt out in all the panic in London." "You're welcome to stay as long as you like," Johnny said. "All three of you. Safe here, and I'm very happy to see all of you unharmed." Rose convinced Fred and me to stay. She thought that after all we'd been through, we should still stay cautious and remain with her father to see how things would go from then on. She was right to ask us. The borders remained closed for about a month. We did hear strange news that convoys of military trucks were rounding up people in England. They then disappeared mysteriously. We decided not to go back to London. There was nothing left for us there. At least here we were safe and we had each other. 4 months after we arrived, we opened a restaurant right there in Glasgow. We kept silent about what we knew. We didn't even tell Johnny. He had friends and colleagues in the government. Fred advised us. The less he knows, the safer he is. We owed it to Fred, and I would not be here today without him. His secret society was behind the pandemic, was the supplier of the vaccine. I thought about trying to expose the OES, Then I realized they are there and always have been. I would be called crazy and probably they would make me also disappear. The fact they didn't know anything about me was the only reason I was still alive. So I decided to remain quiet, keep my anonymity. To live and not forget, I told myself the virus was gone, it didn't matter. Well, I suppose that was true until next time. I just hoped that I would not be around to see it then. I was focused on the now. We are together, safe, and we had some hope that was better than none. So many people were not so lucky as we are. About 6 months later, I'd finished my work early that day and got back to my new home. I heard my phone ping, so I checked. It was a friend request on Facebook from my sister. The end.